One more shout of praise. Amen. You guys can take your seats. So I found my page. So we're in our series today, our summer series, and it's called The Other Guys. So maybe you've been with us for the past few weeks, so you would know what it's about. But what we're talking about is the stories in the Bible that we don't often hear preaching on. So last month actually, I got the privilege of speaking on the story of Hosea, which I mentioned is a story that doesn't make it to the kids' Bibles, for good reason. It's a story about a prophet marrying a prostitute. Just imagine the conversations you'd have to have in the evening after reading that. But today, I'm speaking on a story that does make it into the kids' Bibles. But as we'll find out, for good reason, large chunks of the story don't make it. So huge parts are cut out. And I'm going to be speaking on the story of Samson today. But first, I want to tell you a story. My mum and sister are here today, and I have a story to tell about a time where I was invited to my sister's youth group. Now, I've been in Moldova for a year. I was doing some training for mission, and I went back to the UK, and my sister invited me to her youth group. And they were going to the beach. It was going to be a nice evening. I thought it was a good way to connect with some British people after being away for so long. But I went along, and the men had a great idea, as men usually do. We were at the beach, and there was one of these buoys. I don't know if that makes sense in your mind, a buoy. But it was this round thing that floats on the water. Maybe buoy, for the American speakers. Buoy. So there are these balls that float on the water, and they help boats know how deep the water is and stuff like this. You can look up after if you really care. But as a group of guys, we were going to swim out to this buoy. And I wasn't that great. Well, I wasn't super confident I'd make it the whole way. But I wanted to swim, and I thought I could just swim halfway and swim back. It'd been a while since I've been swimming. But actually, in the past, I was also a lifeguard, so I'd be the one who would be saving people and stuff like this. So I thought I'd be fine. About halfway to this buoy, I realized I wasn't fine. I was just exhausted. It was like I couldn't really give much left. And so I turned onto my back, and I was just trying to do what I could to stay afloat and make it towards the buoy. The men that I was with were about 20 meters in front of me, so they couldn't help. I realized I couldn't swim back because I probably wouldn't make it, so I had to keep going to this buoy. So I finally made it, thankfully, after lots of prayer. And I just grabbed onto this thing for my life to stay afloat and have a bit of a rest. And so at that moment, I realized I had another problem. I had to get back. So I told the guys, look, I have a problem here. I'm not going to make it back. And thankfully, one of them offered me his shoulders. So he was swimming, and I was holding onto his shoulders, trying to just stay afloat and kick my legs as much as I could. But there I was. I've been trained to save other people's lives, but actually I needed someone to rescue me. I needed someone to deliver me from that situation. And the thing is that in life, we all go through situations where we need someone to deliver us. We need rescuing from these situations. We all face this. Maybe you can think of times in your life where you've had problems, specific situations where you couldn't do it alone anymore. You needed someone outside of you to come and help you out of it, or you needed something to happen outside of you to help you out of that situation. Maybe you can think of problems that you've had, maybe something physical or mental or spiritual where you need delivering from that situation. You need a deliverer. Nastia, this is the question. Do you understand the word deliverer? Yes. In the first service, Nastia said that people could watch our sermons on YouTube, and if it's me, you need subtitles. So if I need to check on a word, I'll check with you. So we're going to look at the story of Samson. And what we're going to see in this story is that God is committed to delivering his people. And this is amazing. Bit of background to get to where we are in Samson. If you want to open your Bibles, it's Judges 13 to chapter 13 to chapter 16 is where the story of Samson is. And a bit of background on how we get to this place is that God has chosen a people, Israel, and they had some problems. They ended up in Egypt, where they had become slaves and they were oppressed, and they're crying out to God. They had a big problem. They needed him to rescue them. They needed a deliverer. And God delivered them. He delivered them out of Egypt, through the desert, and into the promised land. And we get to a place where God tells them that they need to conquer this land, and they need to drive out the people from the land. And there was a reason for this. It was because these people were evil, and they were doing horrible things. And so God said to his people, you need to drive out the people who are there. Because if any of them stayed, God knew that it would affect his own people. His own people would end up following the ways of these evil people. So we get to a point where most of the people are cleared out, but not quite all of them. And God's people, instead of clearing them all out, they actually disobey God. And they leave some of these groups of people there, and the problems start. God was right. It was going to cause problems for his people. So after this, there's this cycle that starts to happen. Because God's people start worshipping false gods, like the nation around them. And there's this cycle that happens. So God he hands over his people to the enemy, and then he raises up a deliverer to get them out of that place. And this is a cycle that kept happening. The people kept turning to false gods, and God would hand them over to the enemy, and then he'd raise up someone to lead them out and free them from the enemy, and then sooner or later they'd be back in that position where they turned away from God, and he handed them over to the enemy. And what is interesting for me here is that it was so much more important for these people to come back to God and be delivered back to him than it was for them to have an easy life. Because when they were handed over to the enemy, it was hard for them. They were oppressed, they were enslaved, all sorts of bad things happened to them. But God cared more about them coming back to him than he did about their easy life. So he'd hand them over to then raise someone up and deliver them. And this is because when God was delivering them, it wasn't just from something. It wasn't just from the enemy, but it was to something. It wasn't just from slavery, but it was to freedom. It wasn't just from the false gods, but it was actually to the true God. God was delivering them back to himself so that they could be in relationship and connected again with the one who made them, the one who loved them, the one who is for them. So it's a great thing that God was putting them through this cycle where he'd bring them back to himself. And that leads us to Samson, who is the 15th judge. Now, the judges were the people that God was raising up, the leaders. So there's been 15 times where this has happened, this cycle. And there's generations of people who have been through this. But these other 14 judges before Samson, they weren't necessarily the best of people. Some of them did good things, and some of them did pretty bad things. But it was really a mix of what you see throughout the Bible. Of these judges are raised up. Sometimes they do good, sometimes bad. But then we get to Samson, and he has a really promising start to his life. So it's in chapter 13 of Judges, and there's an angel who comes to a woman who is unable to have children. And so this angel comes and says that you'll have a child. There's this child promised, and he's going to deliver Israel. I'll just read in Judges 13, verse 5. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. The Philistines were the people who were still in the land, the enemies. And God had promised a child in a situation where it was impossible. It wasn't the first time in the Bible that this had happened. It wasn't the last time either. But it seems that when God did this, that he was making a statement. It was something significant was going to happen through this child. because it was clear it wasn't done through human works or through humans, but it was done through promise and through God. So God says that this child is to be a Nazarite from birth. And what that meant is that the child was to take a vow, because in God's law, he made a Nazarite vow where people could, for a specific time, not drink alcohol, not drink wine, not eat grapes, and not have their hair cut. And this would be a way of showing that they're taking this vow. But what was important, it wasn't necessarily the things they were doing, it's what it meant. So Samson's famous for his long hair. That's part of the vow that actually he would have for his whole life. But what's important isn't his long hair, it's what it meant. And what it meant is that he was consecrated to God, or he was dedicated to God. He was set apart for God's purposes. And we see here as well, we actually see what God's purposes are for him. It says that he shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. So God has promised this child, and he's given him a purpose. So Samson grew up. We read at the end of chapter 13, and he was blessed by God, and God's spirit began to stir him. So it's a promising start to Samson's life. But the very next thing that we read is that Samson was going after a foreign woman. And this is a problem. And I will explain why it's a problem. Because you might know, but according to England, I have married a foreign woman. And this is a problem to England, it turns out. Because recently they changed the law so that it has become very difficult for me to move to England with my foreign wife. It's very difficult for us to get a visa. But with Samson, it's not a matter of visas. With Samson, actually, God had commanded his people not to marry foreign wives. And there was a reason behind this. It was because the foreign wives were worshipping foreign gods. And so God knew if they marry a foreign wife, they'll be led to worship foreign gods. And this was proved later in the Old Testament by a man named Solomon, who was the wisest man of the Old Testament. And he had all the wisdom in the world, but he ended up worshipping false gods. And the reason for that was because he married a bunch of foreign wives. So God knew. And here's Samson, promising start, but now he's wanting to marry a foreign lady. And Samson's parents, they lightly challenged him on his decision or his idea to marry a foreign lady. But it says in the Bible that Samson did what was right in his own eyes. And actually, this was typical of the time that he was living in. In the book of Judges, it says multiple times that the leaders and the people did what was right in their own eyes. And the problem with that is that our eyes are really limited. We see the here and now. We have a very limited perspective through our view. But God's view is unlimited. He sees everything. So it's not so important for them to do what's right in their own eyes, but they're meant to be doing what was right in God's eyes. But here's Samson doing what was right in his own eyes. And from here, things get chaotic. This led to problems. And it seems like Samson's life started to spiral out of control. I'll just try to give you a few points to get the idea. And this is the part of the story that I have not yet to read in a kid's book. Because Samson, at his wedding, he makes a bet with the Philistines, who are the enemies, who he's actually meant to be delivering his people from. And his wife helps the Philistines to win the bet. So Samson goes and kills 30 men to pay for the debt, for this bet that he lost. Next thing we find out, his wife has been handed over to his best man. So not a good start to a marriage. And Samson takes revenge on the Philistines by burning a lot of their fields. They're not very happy about this. So they take revenge on him by killing his wife and her father. So Samson then, he kills some people, he hides in a cave. He gets handed over by his own people to the enemy. And the Spirit of God comes on him and he kills 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey. This is crazy. But it's really a bit of a mess. Like, if you think of the type of dramas that you get on TV, this is a new level. It's really a mess, and it looks like it's just out of control. But the thing is that it wasn't outside of God's control. The story kind of gets a bit complicated here, because God was using this to begin fulfilling what he said he'd do through Samson. God was actually using this to begin the deliverance of his people from the Philistines. There's moments as well when Samson is fighting that, well, every single time actually, it says that he's empowered by God's Spirit. It's in God's strength that he's getting the victories over the enemies in these situations. But at the same time, he keeps making these horrible decisions and he keeps sinning against God. He's often motivated by revenge and anger rather than by God's will. And there's times where he gives himself the glory after he fights. And we see as well he has uncontrolled lust, and he keeps following what is right in his own eyes. So my question is, what do we do with the story? It seems there's kind of two sides to it. And there's this tension between the fact that Samson's doing some horrible things, but God is actually using him to deliver his people. There's this irony with Samson, that he was the strongest man physically, but actually he was completely weak in his character and weak spiritually. He was gifted by God, but he didn't have the maturity or the character to match that. And what we see here, and what we see in other parts of the Bible, is that our gifting doesn't necessarily reflect our character or our maturity. A gift is a gift from God. It's given. Like with the Spirit, you get the gift of the Spirit. But then character is something that's developed. Character comes from the fruit of the Spirit. And fruit is something that's produced over time. It's produced by being with Jesus and being in him and getting everything from him. I heard it said one time that you can hang a gift on a dead tree, but the dead tree is never going to produce fruit. But we want to be people who produce fruit and are rooted in Jesus. So maybe for Samson, his life would have been a little bit different if he had the maturity and the character to match this. And we're going to see in the last story of his life that he still doesn't have that character to match his gifting. But what we're also going to see, and what I want to really emphasize, is that God is going to do something amazing through it. So the last story of his life is the story with Delilah, and maybe you've heard this one because this is the one that's famous. But Samson falls in love with this woman, again, not an Israelite, and he has a problem because she gets bribed a lot of money to try find out his secret and hand him over to the enemy. And when I say a lot of money, it's thought that it's around a few $1 million worth of silver that she was bribed by the enemy to hand him over to them. So Samson actually lies to her a few times and tricks her, and 3 times he tells her that to get rid of his strength, that she has to do these different things. So one of them is to tie him up, the other is to tie his hair, and each time she tries it on him and then tells him that the Philistines are upon him. So the thing that I didn't quite understand is, after maybe first or second time, why didn't he realize that this relationship was not going well? Like, she kept trying these things on him to bind him, to take away his strength and hand him over to the enemy. But he's still with her. And in Judges 16, verse 15, we see what it comes down to. Delilah said to Samson, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You've mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies." This is what it comes down to for him. It comes down to the question, how can you say, I love you? How can you say you love me, Samson? It's like, how can you say you love me if you're going to put God before me? How can you say you love me if you're not going to tell you your secret? Because this strength, it wasn't just about the hair. It was about the fact that he was dedicated to God. It was about the fact that he was set apart for God's purposes. So him giving her the secret is not only telling her that she can cut his hair, but it's actually saying that he's not going to be... saying that this purpose doesn't matter to him. It's giving up his dedication, his consecration to God. Losing his hair is more than just his hair. It's about the vow and the fact he was set apart for God. So here we are. She's challenging his love for her. And it's that question of, are you going to love me more or love God more? He falls for her in the end. It says that she nags him and he's just tired of it. And he tells her. So he gets his hair cut. And it says that the Lord left him. Like, this is serious for him at that point. It says that the Lord left him. And he ended up handed over to the enemy in prison and with his eyes gouged out. It's a pretty bad situation to end up in for this man who is meant to deliver God's people from the enemy. But here we are, and it looks bad on Samson, and the enemy start worshiping their God, saying that their God has handed over Samson to them. So it looks bad on Samson, but it also looks bad on God. But if we remember, God actually made a promise. If we remember, God said that he would use Samson to deliver Israel, his people, from the enemy. So Samson cries out to God one last time. He prays in chapter 16, verse 28. He prays to God. Samson called to the Lord and said, "Oh Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." So his physical sight was lost, but maybe at this point he could see a bit clearer spiritually. And he cries out to God. He still has this kind of self-focus because he wants revenge for his eyes. But he cries out to God, and God hears him. In verse 29 and 30, it says, Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. At this point, all the rulers of the Philistines, the enemy, were together. And there was a bunch of people there with him. And it was in this moment that he was able to deliver his people from the Philistines. It was in this moment, in his weakness, that he was able to do it. Because this is where the rulers were together. Now that people would be free to rule over themselves and live free from the rule of the enemy. But what's incredible to me is this picture. Because it wasn't in glory and strength and honor of a military victory that Samson had his greatest victory. But it was in weakness and shame and a result of his sin and his flaws, which actually led him there. But God used it to give him his greatest victory. For me, that's the most incredible thing about this, is that God was faithful to his promise, even though Samson was unfaithful. And God still fulfilled his purpose through Samson, no matter what Samson did to mess it up. As a young boy, I grew up seeing the story of Samson as this kind of hero, this man with superhuman strength, like almost superhero type man. He was a man of God and doing God's will. He was in the Bible. But now that I look at the full picture, it's harder to see that. It's harder to see Samson as the hero. It's debatable, right? There's maybe some things he did good and then some things that weren't so good. But what's clear is that the real hero here was God. It was God who kept delivering Samson from his enemies. It was God who gave Samson the greatest victory in his death. It was God who kept coming through. And it was God who came through for his people and delivered his people. You see, it was sin and weakness and flaws that led Samson to his death. But in his death, God delivered his people. And we know the bigger picture. We know that God actually is so committed to delivering his people that he gave his only son. It wasn't just Samson's sacrifice that delivered his people. It was his son's sacrifice. And it was the flaw, weakness, and sin of humanity that led Jesus to his death. Not his own sin, but the sins of the world. But it was in that moment that God gave him his greatest victory. It was in that moment that Jesus rose again. He defeated death. He defeated the enemy and made a way for the deliverance of all of God's people. What we see is that God is committed to the deliverance of his people. So what does that mean for us? What that means for us is that we can trust in the fact that God wants to deliver us. He wants to deliver us for eternity, but he also wants to deliver us now. And he's not just delivering us from something, he's delivering us to something. Not just from death, but to life, eternal with him. Not just from the enemy, but actually into his own kingdom, where we get to lovingly worship and serve the one who loves us. God delivers us. So what I want to do right now is pray. I want to pray for God to deliver us. I'm thinking of 3 groups of people. And if any of these are you, I'd just like you to raise your hand after I mention them so that I know who to pray for. So the first group of people that I want to pray for is people who have a situation in life right now that they need delivering from. They need rescuing from. They understand that they can't do it alone. Maybe they feel like they're equipped like me as a lifeguard, but they've come to a place where they need someone else to actually rescue them and deliver them out of that situation. God is committed to delivering us, and he can do anything. So if that's you right now, I'd just like you to raise your hand so that I know who to pray for. Thank you. The next group of people are people who have been struggling with a particular habit or addiction, and you're at a point where you just can't deal with it anymore. You've tried all that you can to break free from it yourself, but you can't. And you need God to deliver you. God has delivered us from the power of sin and given us the strength to overcome it. So if that's you, I'd just like you to raise your hand so that I know who I'm praying for. Thank you. And the final group of people are people who have never experienced God's deliverance before. So these are people who maybe you've heard of God, but you haven't surrendered your life to him. And you haven't experienced that deliverance from death and weakness and sin to life with him eternally in strength and in victory. So if that's you and you'd like to make that decision today to follow him, then I'd just like you to raise your hand now so I know who I'm praying for. Thank you. So I'll just pray, but let's remind ourselves that God is committed to delivering his people. And he has done everything necessary in his son to do it. He's done everything necessary in his son for us to live in strength and victory and relationship with him for all eternity. So Father, I thank you for what you've done.